Hi, I'm Ashish Arora. I'm a professor of strategy at the Fuqua School of Business. For many inventions, the journey to commercialization begins with a startup. Now, for the founders and investors, the way they recover their money is by selling to another firm, by being acquired by another firm. Now, in the life of a startup, there are several inflection points at which a sale or an acquisition makes sense. So for example, one is when the technology has been validated, you've demonstrated that the technology works. A second could be after that when you've validated the commercial potential, say for an enterprise product, you've got a couple of credible customers, right? So these are two inflection points, for example. Now, what's the key trade-off? As you proceed through these various stages of the startup, the amount of value the founders can capture increases, right? The startup becomes more valuable because you've demonstrated technology, you've demonstrated commercial potential, and so on. So on the one hand, you'd like to delay the sale for as long as possible to get the most value. But on the other, moving from one point to another carries a lot of risk. There's execution risk. You may not hire the right people. You may make a bad decision. There's business risk. The initial set of customers you try may not work out, or just bad luck, and you may just run out of cash before you're ready. You move the next stage. So if you're a founder, you've got to trade these two factors. On the one hand, a later stage would increase value, but on the other hand, you may not get to the later stage. You may fail for a variety of reasons, some of which are beyond your control, and therefore get nothing. Okay, so how should we make this decision? With my colleagues Andrea Fosfuri and Thomas Ronde, we came up with a simple analytical model, and this model highlights three factors that guide this decision. First, how experienced are the founders and how well-funded is the startup? Now, experience means have the founders, for example, built and sold a startup before, so they know what it takes to move from one stage to another. Second, what is the rate at which the valuations increase? How much more value is created from taking a startup, let's say from the technology stage to the commercial validation stage? And this will, in some measure, depend on, for example, what's happening on the other side of the market, how many potential acquirers there are. So typically, as you move to a later stage, the company becomes more viable, the startup becomes more viable, and there are potentially more acquirers. But so that's number two. And number three is what is involved in trying to find a buyer at an early stage, let's say at the technology validation stage. And here, for example, there are concerns that in trying to find a buyer, the founder and founding CEOs and the founding team may be spending too much time trying to find buyers rather than to develop the company. Or another concern, for example, quite significant, is in trying to get buyers, you may disclose a lot of information, and that then makes you vulnerable to imitation. Somebody may knock off what you're doing. Let me give you an example of a company that was set up for an early exit. Now, you might think, before I give you the example, you might think, hey, why don't I just decide, as things come along? The reason it's important for founders to think about it early, even before they've started, is because it's going to determine, for example, how you raise capital, how much capital you raise, and whom you hire. So let me give you an example. There's a company there was a company called Dr. John's, which came up with a new product called a spin brush. Now, this was an inexpensive electric toothbrush that could be produced cheaply enough that you could sell it for about the same price as a manual toothbrush. So it's not competing with super high-end electric toothbrushes, but it was the first one that you could retail for like $5 or $6. Now, John Osher, the founder, and the founding team intended from the very beginning to have an early exit. which means, for example, they spent no money on building an organization or on developing a manufacturing ability or marketing or sales. There's very little of that. All of their energy was devoted to two things: developing a prototype that could be manufactured cheaply enough, and then demonstrating that there was significant demand for it. And in the end, they succeeded in attracting the attention of Procter & Gamble, which did not have an electric toothbrush in its portfolio, and which acquired them for a very handsome amount. Now, it ended well for them, but it could easily have gone badly. For example, while they were trying to get to Procter & Gamble could have decided to imitate them, to say, hey, we can develop our own low-cost electric toothbrush. And the patent protection that this company had on their spin brush was really quite narrow and quite slim. And so it would not have been difficult for Procter & Gamble to have imitated them and reverse engineered it. It didn't, but this tells you both the benefits and the costs of an early exit, and it also tells you of the importance of preparing for what, or deciding on what your strategy is on when you want to exit. So what should founders do? How should they decide on their exit strategy? Well, our simple model highlights two factors. One is, how experienced is the founding team? Remember, one of the risks of delaying, of trying to go to a later stage, is that the venture may not survive. Experienced teams that have built and developed ventures before are less likely to have these kinds of execution failures, and therefore the venture is more likely to reach the later stage. So obviously, experienced founding teams should it makes sense for them to try to reach later, to sell at a later stage. Inexperienced teams should try to sell at an earlier stage. Teams that are in between can adopt a more flexible strategy where they can entertain early offers, but then also have the option to try to develop the venture to a later stage. Now, the second factor is what is the risks of imitation when you're trying to sell at an early stage? What is the risk of information leakage? And here the IP, the intellectual property environment, matters. When intellectual property protection is good, trying to sell the venture early is a relatively low risk proposition, because even when you disclose information, your intellectual property protection, your patent protection can protect you. In other cases, this may leave the startup, if the patent protection is not good, or if the IP environment is not good, it may leave the startup more vulnerable. And so when the IP environment, IP protection is relatively weak, there is a greater reason, or it's more attractive to try to take the company to a later stage, which means in such an environment, you should plan adequately when you raise capital and when you think about hiring and building a founding team, to have the kind of talent that you need that would enable you to take the venture to a later stage.